我们对美方强行控制。
China expresses grave concern over the U.S. forcibly detaining President Maduro and his wife and transferring them out of the country. The U.S. actions clearly violate international law and basic norms of international relations, as well as the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. China calls on the U.S. to ensure the safety of President Maduro and his wife, immediately release them, cease subverting the Venezuelan government, and resolve the issue through dialogue and negotiations. China supports the UN Security Council in convening an emergency meeting on the U.S. military strike against Venezuela and supports the Council in fulfilling its due role in accordance with its responsibilities. China stands ready to work with the international community to resolutely uphold the UN Charter, adhere to the bottom line of international morality, and safeguard international fairness and justice. China is closely monitoring the security situation in Venezuela. At present, there are no reports of Chinese personnel in Venezuela being affected by the U.S. airstrikes. Mr. Qiu Xiaoqi is the Chinese government's special representative for Latin American affairs, and visiting Latin American countries is part of his duties. China has always maintained good communication and cooperation with the Venezuelan government. China respects Venezuela's sovereignty and independence and believes the Venezuelan government will properly handle its internal affairs in accordance with its constitution and laws. Regarding the second question, China-Venezuela cooperation is cooperation between sovereign states, protected by international law and the laws of both countries. Regardless of changes in Venezuela's political situation, China's willingness to deepen practical cooperation in all fields between the two countries will not change, and China's legitimate interests in Venezuela will be protected according to law. China firmly supports the status of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, opposes the use or threat of force in international relations, and rejects any bullying practices that violate the purposes of the UN Charter and infringe upon the sovereignty of other countries. China has consistently advocated that relations among nations should be conducted in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We urge the United States to stop using the so-called China threat as an excuse to pursue its own interests. Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory, and the Taiwan issue is purely China's internal affair. How to resolve the Taiwan issue is the business of the Chinese people themselves. No external force has the right to interfere. The Democratic Progressive Party forces' attempts to seek independence through external forces and resist reunification by force are despicable and doomed to failure. We pursue a foreign policy of partnership rather than alliance. Regarding the situation in Iran you mentioned earlier, I wish to reiterate that China hopes the Iranian government and people can overcome current difficulties and maintain national stability. China has consistently opposed external interference in Iran's internal affairs and calls on all parties to do more to promote peace and stability in the Middle East. No matter how the international landscape evolves, China will remain a good friend and partner to Latin American and Caribbean countries, maintaining continuity and stability in its policies toward the region. We adhere to the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, respect the choices of the Latin American people, and do not draw lines based on ideology. China's exchanges and cooperation with Latin American countries have always been conducted on the basis of equality and mutual benefit, without seeking spheres of influence or targeting any party. China has noted the statement issued by the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the response made by the United Arab Emirates. We commend both Saudi Arabia and the UAE for emphasizing respect for each other's sovereignty and security. The international community widely recognizes the legitimate government of Yemen. China has consistently supported the preservation of Yemen's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. We welcome the convening of the Southern Yemeni Dialogue in Riyadh and call on all parties to exercise calm and restraint, persist in resolving differences and disputes through political dialogue, and create conditions for the early restoration of peace and tranquility in Yemen.